What if I told you that one of the oldest civilizations known to history left behind a written record claiming that kings ruled for hundreds of thousands of years before the flood? Not somebody writing this shit down in 2026, not some modern internet conspiracy channel. I'm talking about ancient Mesopotamian scribes writing in cuneiform on clay. And here's where it gets interesting. The Sumerian King List says that before the flood, 8 kings across 5 cities ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Now here's the question. Are we supposed to believe the Sumerians simply made this shit up? Or are we looking at a record that modern historians haven't completely figured out how to interpret? Because if you take the document literally, we're no longer talking about a civilization that's only a few thousand years old. We're talking about a written tradition reaching hundreds of thousands of years into the past. And that's where this rabbit hole gets deep. Let's get something straight from the beginning. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the damn document, because that's where the conversation should start. The Sumerians didn't leave us one little clay tablet and disappear. Cuneiform was used in Mesopotamia for more than 3,000 years, and thousands upon thousands of clay tablets have survived. And these weren't all mythology. Some tablets recorded grain, livestock, taxes, contracts, property, workers, mathematics, administrative transactions, even school exercises. So these people were keeping records, detailed records. And that's important, because when somebody tells you, oh, those ancient people just made everything up, really? They were keeping track of barley, silver, workers, land, livestock, and legal transactions. But suddenly, when they started talking about their own ancient kings, well, that part doesn't count. That's where I start asking questions. The people we call the Sumerians lived in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now primarily southern Iraq. They developed one of humanity's earliest known writing systems. And here's another important point. The writing wasn't carved into stone. It was pressed into wet clay. A reed stylus was pushed into the clay, creating the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. Then the tablet could dry or be fired. And thousands of years later, we're still reading some of them. Think about that. A person living thousands of years ago could press a reed into wet clay and leave a message that survives long enough for somebody thousands of years later to read it. That's extraordinary. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The Sumerian King List isn't simply a list of kings. It is a political and chronological document that attempts to organize kingship across different cities. The surviving versions aren't all identical. There are multiple copies in textual traditions, and that matters because there wasn't some guy named Sumerian King List author sitting at a desk writing the whole damn thing. We don't know the individual author. The text was transmitted and copied by scribes. One of the best known surviving examples is the Well-Blundell Prism, now held by the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The prism dates to roughly 3,800 years ago. It was found in the region of Larsa in modern Iraq and was presented to the museum in 1923. And the prism is not some modern reconstruction. It's an actual ancient clay artifact covered in cuneiform. 4 sides, 2 columns on each side, recording kings, cities, and reign links. So now, let's read what the damn thing actually says. The text but kingship descended from heaven. Then kingship was established at Eridu, and the first king named is Alulim. His reign, 28,800 years. Then comes Alojar. His reign, 36,000 years. Together, the text gives them 64,800 years. Then kingship moves to another city, Bad Tabira. And now we get to a name we've already talked about, Enmenluana. The king list gives him a reign of 43,200 years. 43,200 years. Not 43 years, not 400, 43,200. Then comes Enmengalana, 28,800 years. Then Dumuzid the shepherd, 36,000 years. Those 3 kings together, 108,000 years. Then kingship moves again. Larak, 1 king, 28,800 years. Then Sapar, Enmendura, 21,000 years. Then Sharupak, Ubaratutu, 18,600 years. And then the text totals the entire pre-flood sequence. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. And then the flood swept over. Now stop right there, because this is where things get interesting. The text itself doesn't stop and say, just kidding. It doesn't say these numbers are symbolic. It doesn't say, dear future archaeologists, please divide these numbers by 600. That's an interpretation that comes later. The ancient document gives the numbers. So the question becomes, what did the ancient scribes believe they were recording? Now somebody is going to say, come on, nobody lives for 43,200 years. Well, thank you. I think everybody understands that a human being doesn't normally live 43,200 years. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is, why did the ancient scribes write the number? That's the question. And this is where I don't want to do something intellectually lazy. I don't want to automatically say they were lying, but I also don't want somebody to automatically say they were symbolic, because both statements require an argument. The Sumerians were perfectly capable of recording ordinary information. We have administrative tablets documenting quantities of grain, animals, labor, and other economic matters. So why are the royal numbers so enormous? That's a legitimate historical question, and there are several possibilities. Maybe the numbers were symbolic. Maybe they represented an ancient conception of kingship. Maybe the numbers were connected to a mathematical or a calendrical system. Maybe the list deliberately projected enormous antiquity to legitimize later rulers. Or, and this is where my question begins, could the tradition preserve some memory of a much older period that we don't yet understand? I am not telling you that the last possibility has been proven. I'm telling you that it is the question worth investigating. Here's the part that really makes you think. The king list doesn't simply give one king an absurdly long reign. It gives 8 kings enormous reigns, and then it totals them. 241,200 years. That's not an accidental number scribbled in the margin. It is part of the structure of the document. Then comes the flood, and after the flood, the numbers change dramatically. Kingship appears at Cush, and eventually the list begins moving toward rulers who are much closer to what we recognize as historical chronology. Now here's the obvious question. Why? Why does the chronology become more human as we move forward? Why does the text have this enormous pre-flood period, followed by a flood, followed by a different kind of chronology? That's the puzzle. Now let's be fair. There is a mainstream interpretation, and we need to understand it if we're going to challenge it. The Ashmolean Museum describes the king list as a combination of myth, legend, and history information rather than history in the modern sense. The museum also suggests the text served a political purpose. The idea was that kingship moved from one city to another, ultimately supporting the political legitimacy of later rulers. In other words, the list may not have been written simply to give us a modern-style chronological history. It may have been political theology. It may have been literature. It may have been a mixture of memory, tradition, ideology, and historical information. And that's important, because we shouldn't pretend that the document automatically proves a 241,200-year-old human civilization. It doesn't. But here's my problem with the opposite extreme. You also shouldn't pretend the 241,200-year number isn't there, because it damn well is. The number is ancient. The writing is ancient. The artifact is ancient. The question is the meaning of the chronology. That's where the debate belongs. Now let's take one step backward. If the king list was compiled thousands of years ago, what sources were the scribes drawing upon? We don't have the original thought process of the individual scribe. We don't have a surviving notebook saying, today I interviewed King so-and-so about what happened 200,000 years ago. We have the text. We have copies. We have related Mesopotamian traditions. We have archaeology. And we have thousands of other chapters that allow researchers to reconstruct portions of ancient Mesopotamian life. That's the evidence. And this is where my research question gets bigger. Because if ancient Mesopotamian scribes inherited traditions from earlier generations, then we have to ask, how far back did those traditions actually go? Did the scribes invent the entire pre-flood chronology? Did they inherit older traditions? Did different city-states preserve different versions? Was the enormous chronology theological, mathematical, political, or could some portion of it preserve a distorted memory of a much older past? We don't have a scientifically demonstrated answer to that last question, but we absolutely have an ancient text telling us that the Sumerian tradition itself remembered an enormous antiquity, and that deserves to be discussed. And don't make the mistake of thinking the King List is the only thing these people wrote. It isn't. Cuneiform was used for more than 3,000 years. We have administrative documents, legal records, mathematical texts, school exercises, religious compositions, myths, royal inscriptions, economic accounts, lists, letters, and historical traditions. The sheer volume of surviving material is enormous, and that's what makes this conversation so damn interesting, because we're not dealing with one isolated document. We're dealing with an enormous body of ancient written material. So when somebody tells you, well, the Sumerians just made this stuff up, my response is, which stuff? The barley receipts, the contracts, the mathematical exercises, the administrative records, the royal inscriptions, the myths, the King List? Because those are different genres of text, and they need to be examined individually. Here's where I want to draw the line. We can confidently say the Sumerian King List is an ancient Mesopotamian text. Multiple versions survived. The well-blundled prism is a major surviving copy dating to roughly 3,800 years ago. The text describes 8 pre-flood kings. It assigns them extraordinarily long reigns. The total given for those 8 kings is 241,200 years. And then the text says the flood came. Those are facts about what the document says. What we cannot honestly claim from this document alone is that archaeology has proven a Sumerian civilization existed 241,200 years ago. That's a separate claim, and that's exactly where the investigation begins. Because now we have to ask, if the text preserves a memory of something older, what physical evidence should we expect to find? Where would it be? What geological layers should contain it? And what other ancient traditions might correspond with it? That's where this gets really damn interesting. So, was Sumer really 241,200 years old? The King List does not prove that by itself, but the King List absolutely does something else. It gives us an ancient civilization recording a chronology that reaches 241,200 years before its flood narrative. And that creates a question, a big one. If those numbers were symbolic, why those numbers? If they were political, why construct such an enormous antiquity? If they preserved older traditions, how old were those traditions? And if ancient scribes inherited information from civilizations that existed before them, how far back does the chain actually go? Because maybe the biggest mistake we can make is assuming that the oldest written record is automatically the beginning of the story. Maybe it's not the beginning. Maybe it's a surviving piece of something much older. Or maybe the ancient scribes were telling us something symbolic that we haven't completely understood yet. Either way, the clay tablet is still sitting there. The numbers are still written on it, and the damn question isn't going anywhere. So in the next episode, we're going to follow the trail before Sumer. We're going to look at the ancient sites of the Nile Valley, Nabta Playa, Göbekli Tepe, and the question of what human societies were doing before the civilizations we're normally taught to call the beginning of history. Because if the story begins before the story we're usually given, then maybe we've been starting the damn book on the wrong page.
Whoa.
The black page.
Amnesia Chronicles.